Within a span of just 1 year since we last looked at it, the state of PlayStation 4 emulation on PC has improved drastically, and it's truly worth revisiting in 2026. Simply put, the emulator of choice, ShadPS4, is not only in a stable state while playing titles like Bloodborne, but in many ways the experience is now superior to the 2015 PS4 original. And Bloodborne is of course a unique case within the PS4's catalogue. It's gone entirely untouched by Sony or From Software since launch, and to this day, the game runs at just 1080p and at an unevenly frame-paced 30fps cap, even if played via back-compat on PS5. For such a venerated title, it's surprising to see it ignored for so long in terms of even a basic 60fps patch on PS5, or more optimistically, a remaster. The upside being that the absence of any official work on the game since launch has galvanized the emulation community on PC, and while there are still rough edges in its emulation, the results today are extraordinary. So let's cut to the chase. Everything you see here is Bloodborne running via ShadPS4 on an i9-13900KF PC equipped with an NVIDIA RTX 4080 GPU and 32GB of RAM. It's running at 4K resolution, 60 frames per second, and with boosted geometry level of detail settings. All of these extras are achievable within the ShadPS4 emulator alone via checkboxes in a patch menu, but as the cherry on the cake, it's also possible to run mods over the top. This one in particular is a must. Created by modder FromSoft, Shadows of the Hunt gives the deluxe experience by adding true dynamic shadow casting to the environment. It improves materials and textures, and using Reshade, it upgrades ambient occlusion shading, temporal anti-aliasing, and more. The idea then is to get as close as possible to what a theoretical official remaster might be, but even in assessing the classic Bloodborne experience with no mods, there's a lot to love here. So firstly, what does it take in terms of settings to get the vanilla game running on a desktop PC in a stable fashion? Is it now possible to get a locked 4K 60fps on an RTX 4080? On the opposite end of the power scale, is ShadPS4 now optimized enough for Bloodborne to run on a handheld like the ROG Xbox Ally X, where CPU and GPU resource is more confined? And finally, what are the visual benefits of mods like Shadows of the Hunt, and what's the performance cost there? Let's find out. To start, it's worth stressing that ShadPS4 does still have lingering visual bugs and freezes, and this is obviously still work in progress. Even so, and after some painstaking trial and error, I've managed to get settings into place for a kind of best case scenario for Bloodborne. I'm using the main branch of ShadPS4 taken directly from the official site, and after installing the launcher and directing it to your Bloodborne install, a few extra steps are needed. First, you'll need to download an executable via the version manager at the top right of ShadPS4. I've loaded pre-release nightly version 0.13.1, but version 0.13 is effectively the same. Crucially, these newer builds contain the shader caching option, which, as I'll get to, drastically improves hitching. Next, right-click on the Bloodborne tile and go to game-specific settings. For the smoothest VSync experience at 60fps, I'd strongly recommend going to the graphics tab and using the FIFO VSync method, rather than the other mailbox option, which seems to hitch and suffer more obvious lurches. Next along, I've selected async logging in the log section, and then you'll need to go to the experimental tab and hit the DevBox console checkbox, and the all-new shader cache option below that. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but if you want to run at resolutions like 1440p or 4K, you'll need to change those two parameters on the right. Bump the additional DRAM allocation to 6GB and boost the VBlank frequency to 9999Hz. The reason being, by default, the emulator only simulates the amount of RAM available on an actual base PS4 system, around 8GB in theory, but since this isn't enough for 4K resolution, we need to allocate more to the task. The consequence of running at even 1440p without this RAM tweak is entertaining for all the wrong reasons. In short, you'll increase the likelihood of seeing vertex explosion bugs, where textures and geometry fail to load in, causing all manner of odd distortions to the world. In fact, cranking the game up to 4K, Central Yharnam turns into a kind of fever dream, so bumping the DRAM up is an essential tweak here. Thanks to Digital Foundry patron iExplosive Rage for these extra tips. If you find there are still issues with vertex explosions, I'd strongly recommend this mod from Nexus Mods. It's a small fix and disables face customization, but it should solve most, if not all, bugs in this vein. Just a few crucial steps left here. Right-click on the Bloodborne tile again, and this time go to Cheats and Patches. Optionally, you can elect to skip the intro, remove chromatic aberration, and motion blur. More pertinent though, to get in the game running well, you'll need the task split patch, increased graphics heap sizes, and the Intel 12 Plus SFX workaround patch, which I find helps avoid crashes. The highest LOD setting is a nice bonus of course, and doesn't affect performance or stability in my testing, so just use the maximum there. And of course, the 60fps patch speaks for itself. Further down, there are patches for resolutions besides Bloodborne's default 1080p, so 4K and 1440p are there as overrides, or you could go down to 560p if you're power limited. With all that in place, let's focus on the vanilla unmodded experience first. The fact of the matter is 4K is now absolutely viable at a locked 60fps on an RTX 4080, though your GPU will determine how high you can push the resolution there. This bonfire in central Yharnam with dozens of enemies is a great stress test, and it just flies by at 4K 60fps. The game's physics engine is in place for cloth and object destruction across the world. Textures, lighting, enemy AI are all true to the PS4 version as well. Plus, of course, we have those improved geometry LODs to minimize pop-in. Great stuff. There is some good and bad news, however. Bad news first, that 60fps line is still punctuated by hitching at points in the world, usually while moving between areas for the very first time. Without ShadPS4 shader cache feature enabled, you'll see hitching as you first turn into new segments of the map, strike an enemy, or use a blood vial, resulting in a sizable 120 millisecond plus frame time spike. Again, we are getting 60fps 99% of the time, so these hiccups are really the outliers, but they do stick out. Now, the good news is that enabling ShadPS4's new shader caching feature at least fixes those hitches after the first encounter. Toggling the mode on in the experimental tab, you'll notice over time a cache folder starts to populate in the ShadPS4 directory for every shader compiled. Ultimately, this does mean that your first time experience of each area will be your worst, as that file amasses more data. Still though, in side-by-sides, it's definitely a step forward over what we had before, and hitches will gradually decrease with more time on the clock. Hitches aside, the VSync experience is shaping up very well then, but what about going above 60fps? First, it's worth pointing out that the game is as much CPU bound as it is a GPU hog, and even in the case of my i9-13900 CPU, multiple threads are near maxing out at points. This alternate overlay shows how heavily ShadPS4's emulation hits select threads. Even so, and even at 4K resolution, the system is comfortably pulling in numbers in the 70 to 120 FPS range, which bodes well. All of which presents a unique problem for the emulator right now, because unfortunately, there's an issue running Bloodborne at around 110 FPS and higher. It's a bug that causes any use of the sprint button to result in slow sliding movement. Regular walking speeds are fine, but something about the animation logic while sprinting is just incompatible with higher frame rates. So for now, the ability to run at high frame rates, even at 4K, is something of a mixed blessing. Assuming there is a way to fix the animation speed though, this could be an incredible way to play Bloodborne. To go one step further, running at 1440p or 1080p only further increases that frame rate. Again, that sprinting bug means I'll only be walking through each area to keep the movement in sync, since so much of the 1080p and 1440p gameplay runs in the triple figures. All of this is purely theoretical then, but it's fascinating to see just how high those numbers go for a PS4 emulator. It's actually tricky to decide on the exact ranges for our graph here, since cutscenes and smaller areas will easily run at 200 or even 300 FPS while at 1080p. The RTX 4080 is complete overkill for the task in these moments. Still, the most critical test is that central Yharnam area, where performance cascades down as you'd expect with each resolution bump, though again 1080p is still often well above 100 FPS even in this worst case. So while each playthrough does have traversal hitches in the very same spots, it points to a future where Bloodborne could in theory be played at absurdly high frame rates, if it can be optimized properly, something to watch out for perhaps in a future build. With some impressive results running the latest ShadPS4 emulator with Bloodborne on a high-end desktop, what about handhelds? Emulation is exceptionally heavy on the CPU, a situation which can cause problems for portable silicon, so we decided to see how Bloodborne ran on the ROG Xbox Ally X, featuring the Z2 Extreme processor. Would it be possible to get an experience that matches or exceeds how the game currently plays on an original PS4 or PS5? Well, the answer is, perhaps surprisingly, yes, as you can see in this off-screen camera footage. A huge thank you to Rich for looking into this and providing all the assets and findings here. The turnout is, while we can't lock to 60 frames per second, we can deliver a very similar experience, and that's thanks to the Ally's VRR display. For the most part, we run in a 50 to 70 frames per second window, so when there are dips under 60, they're mostly unnoticeable. Here's how we did it. First of all, we're using the unlock frame rate patch, along with reducing resolution from the standard 1080p to 720p, which still looks absolutely fine on a 7-inch display. Crucially though, we're running the Ally X under mains power, which locks the APU to a maximum 35 watts. As we can't show VRR from Ally X in our video, we're using VSync off as an alternative, which will deliver similar frame times. In a lot of our handheld testing, there's barely any difference between 25 watts and 35 watt results, classic diminishing returns, but in the case of ShadPS4, the extra wattage does seem to shore up CPU performance, and we need it. While stuttering is present in the desktop tests, even in the best case with caching engaged, it's far more of an issue here. Perhaps because in a handheld, both CPU and GPU are fiercely competing for available bandwidth and to keep within the power budget. In fact, in this test running through Yarnum, it's just this section here where we see stutter, and even then, well, sometimes this scenario doesn't show any problems, making it difficult to isolate the problem. There's still a slight sense of instability here, but these are the best case results, and ultimately you're getting a game that retains the original visuals and runs at pretty much twice the frame rate as PS4, giving fluidity, animation, and input lag advantages. In full flow, it's exceptionally impressive stuff. Running on mains at 35 watts isn't exactly ideal though, is it? You want to be able to take Bloodborne on the go after all. Here's where we found some problems though. Taking the mains adapter away from the Ally X takes you down to 25 watts, and while overall average frame rates are just a touch lower, suddenly there's intrusive and egregious stutter. Occasional 200 millisecond spikes are commonplace, but over 500 milliseconds, half a second, can also happen. There is mitigation though. You can smooth off a lot of the stuttering by popping into the command center and using a manual power profile. Changing SPL and SPPT to 25 watts takes those mammoth stutters and turns them more into blips. Still annoying that they're there, but less noticeable. Further tweaks to power, perhaps with higher wattages, may help, so I created an extreme manual profile, basically ramping up all the available variables to max. Total system power draw is a nuts 50 to 65 watts in my testing, so maybe 1.5 hours of gaming from the 80 watt hour battery, but I still seem to see that mini stutter that you don't see when connected to the mains, which remains the best way to play Bloodborne on the Xbox Ally X handheld. And I think the camera off-screen video shows it best. A quote-unquote Xbox handheld might not be able to deliver 1080p 60, you'll need Strix Halo for that, but what you are getting at 720p is image quality that's perfectly fine for the Ally X's screen, and in the best conditions, a relatively smooth high frame rate experience, and that's very cool. Last of all then, let's switch back to desktop PC to check out the mod scene for Bloodborne as it stands in 2026. There's a real luxury of choice here, but the big highlight for me is this one by modder from SoftServe called Shadows of the Hunt. It's available on Nexus Mods as a large 15GB download, and once installed by simply copy-pasting the contents to the game's directory, it makes some genuinely impressive changes. I covered it last year under its older name, Bloodborne Remaster Project, and you can hear all the details directly in FromSoftServe's own excellent YouTube video. A year on, and after a title change, the big highlight really is the fully dynamic shadow casting, which replaces the baked shadow system used in the original game. It means your character and the environment cast shadows from the sun in a more logical way. So for example, your character can now appear half within a shadow and half out. Also, all elements of the world will cast shadows properly, hence extra tree shadows spread across the back of central Yharnam here. And finally, extra point lights are added to the scene, meaning your character will cast a shadow where previously there was none. The snag is that the mod, right now, introduces some flickering shadows on buildings and trees, but it's still very impressive work, and truly dynamic shadow casting from the environment is something I'd love to see in an official Bloodborne remaster. On top of shadows, the game's materials are also adjusted via the mod. Parallax occlusion maps are tweaked, adding a greater sense of height and depth to the cobblestones across the pathways of the Hunter's Dream. In some cases, the original developer, From Software, had POM prepared for a surface as a variable, but it went unused in the final game, and the mod reintroduces that effect on PC. Elsewhere, surface PBR values are adjusted to allow for a less wet and slimy look to some materials. Hence, the streets of Yharnam have less of a dewy wet sheen with the mod, while other objects emphasize the effect to give them more of a reflective appearance. The guiding logic, it seems, is to bring the visuals more in line with how material reaction works in newer Souls titles, like Dark Souls 3 onwards. Layering over these changes, the author also provides a reshade profile, which injects other effects into the game. All of the parameters can be adjusted within this overlay. First up, the game's poor default FXAA method is disabled, and in its place, Reshade adds a more effective, temporal anti-aliasing pass that treats shimmer and noise in motion more capably. Color grading is tweaked by the Area 2, and finally, in a similar vein to the TAA, the game's default screen space ambient occlusion setting is disabled and replaced with MXAO via Reshade. This ultimately removes the flickering under foliage seen in the PS4 original, and in its place, MXAO adds a thicker, more stable indirect shading pass to the world. Again, if it's not to your taste, all of these are tweakable in the Reshade menu, but the result makes for a stark change that often works in its favour, I think. With so many extras fixed in place, there is of course an inevitable performance cost. First up, I will say that the mod does introduce some bugs, like flickering shadows, especially in cutscenes, which I haven't been able to fix just yet. In terms of the frame rate metrics, running the mod also clearly has an impact over the vanilla experience. Yes, there was some headroom to work with before the mod, but the reality is that we're now in the 45 to 65 FPS range at 4K. There's no unlocked frame rate graph here in this case, as some of the reshade effects don't play ball with the FCAT border which we use, but the MSI diagnostics at top right should tell the whole story here. In short, my i9-13900 CPU and RTX 4080 setup isn't up to the challenge of locking at 60 FPS consistently here, and V-syncing this will reveal drops under. So ultimately, the only course of action is to drop to 1440p, which immediately helps boost the frame rate to a more acceptable level. Even then, locking at 60 FPS isn't a total guarantee, and there are some blips under with the mod in tow. So the takeaway is that pushing Bloodborne in this direction demands a serious desktop PC. A year on from our original video testing the ShadPS4 emulator, the ongoing optimization efforts for Bloodborne have paid off handsomely. Assuming you just want the classic Bloodborne experience at 4K 60 or 1440p 60, this is now infinitely more viable, especially so with the shader cache option merged into recent builds. A pre-compilation shader pass would be better of course, but once those shaders start populating the cache folder, the game runs fluidly for hours at a time. Once the emulator's all set up, it's actually easy to forget that it's running in emulation at all, outside of some occasional hitches. It's impressive progress, while the Shadows of the Hunt mod takes the whole project in an adventurous direction with visual tweaks that better fit the idea of a remaster. Above all though, the emulator's biggest achievement here today is that it runs on a handheld like the ROG Xbox Ally X. The fact we're playing a PS4 emulator on a 25-watt system while in a portable state, and doubling the game's original frame rate no less, is a great sign for its scalability. It's evidence that Bloodborne emulation will work for most PC setups in between, power spec wise, and so, if you've the means or inclination, it's seriously worth checking out. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To support what we do at Digital Foundry, check out our Patreon, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find us. But for now, thanks for watching.